song. It's live now. Okay. Sam, Jeannie said that she's looking for the link. So I'm sure he'll do that next. Yeah. Okay, well, we are live now, but I think the link has not gone out to the rest of the church. So, Sam, should we wait to introduce ourselves until that's gone out? Well, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, happy Sabbath, everyone. So excited to be a part of this Eastside SC Fellowship panel discussion on the Desire of Ages. We're on chapter 25, The Call by the Sea. My name is Marvin Lee. I am one of the elders at Eastside SCA Fellowship. Been around since the beginning, a long time ago. And by trade, I'm an attorney. I've got 3 kids, one who's already grown and married, and the other 2 who are both going to turn 21. Actually, they'll be 21 for the same week next month. They're called Abby and Seth. So I'll be leading out the panel discussion today, and I'm thrilled to have Valexa, Michael, and Brandon. Valexa has been one of my panelists before, but we've got some new panelists today. I'm excited about that. I'll ask each panelist to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexa. I moved here to Washington last year, actually just past my, I guess, a year and 2 months ago. So this Eastside Church has been a huge help in getting me settled in and feeling like my church family here. And I'm very excited to be on the panel today. I am a software engineer. That's why I moved out here. And yeah, I graduated in 2022. So it's been interesting trying to live on my own for the first time out here in Washington. So yeah, excited to be on the panel today.
Hi, I'm Michael. I moved out here about, say, 9 months ago. Also for work, I'm an industrial design engineer, um, and I've been attending Eastside for about 6 months, give or take. And like Alexa, they've been a huge help in feeling like community and fellowship and stuff like that. And especially doing something like this where we can all like share and talk about God.
Awesome. And good morning, everyone. My name's Brandon. My family moved out here to the greater Seattle area about 2 years ago, also for a career move, work in the healthcare technology space. I have a wife and 2 kids that are 12 and 9 years old, respectively. And we've been attending Eastside Church for, I'd say, about a month and a half or so. So it was really a significant blessing that we were randomly just invited to attend service one day, and really just felt a strong connection to the people and the message and the community that's there. And excited to be a part of the panel. Thank you for the opportunity to come and dive a little bit deeper into this lesson.
Super. All right, I'll just give a quick introduction to the chapter. It is chapter 25, The Call by the Sea. And I think a lot of people are familiar with the story, especially around the miracle with Jesus urging Peter to cast his net into the water during the daytime when people in that area find you can't really be successful. I didn't quite realize why, and then the reading said basically, with the net during the day, the waters are clear, so the fish see the net, so they avoid the net. So that's why. Oh, okay. So at nighttime, they'd been laboring all night trying to catch fish and unsuccessfully. And but Jesus tells Peter, go ahead and cast again, and he reluctantly did, and there was so much fish, the nets were breaking. And James and John, who were in the other boat, had to come by and help. And then at the end of it, both boats were almost sinking because the amount of fish that had been caught. So the backdrop to this is that it was kind of a it's a fragile time for the disciples, because the predecessor of Jesus, John the Baptist, who would gain a lot of popular attention, had been imprisoned. In my discussion questions, I mistakenly said that they'd heard of his execution. That doesn't come until a little bit later. But just the fact that he'd been imprisoned was very discouraging to the disciples. And by that time, they'd already been met with not just resistance, but criticism and sabotage on the part of the Jewish leaders. So it was a tough time for them. And this miracle and what happened after, with Jesus calling these disciples to go all in being his followers, is the subject of the reading. So we'll go ahead and launch right into the first discussion. Excuse me. I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat and then read it for everyone. The disciples were weary in body and spirit. They had toiled all night and caught no fish, and were weighed down by the news of John the Baptist's executions, actually his imprisonment. Can you think of a time when a combination of physical duress and spiritual discouragement made it difficult to be optimistic about life, about faith? Please share.
Yeah, for this one, what immediately came to mind, maybe it wasn't exactly physical duress, but maybe mental duress a little bit, and especially a lot of spiritual discouragement. So for some context, I had worked for a company since I was a junior in high school. I did an internship for them, like a technical internship program thing, from when I was the summer after my junior year of high school until the summer after my freshman year of college. And it's like a pretty big company in North Carolina, like very well known. Like if you work there in North Carolina, everyone's like, oh, that's great. Like you should just stay there. Most people have their whole careers there. It's like a very kind of older established tech company. So I, being from North Carolina, I was like, okay, this is great. Like I'm set. I'll work here forever. And then after my last internship there, my third internship, I didn't know it was going to be my last. I was talking to some coworkers and I realized I was being paid less than my other coworkers. And then I was kind of comparing on paper. I was like, we worked for the same teams. We have the same major. We studied the same thing. We've been doing the same projects. Okay, honestly, the only factor that this boils down to, it seems like, is race. And so after that, I had to go through like a whole process with the team. And they were like, yeah, you were paid fairly. We're not allowed to discuss. Da, da, da. So I was like, okay, I'm never working for you guys again. And so I just abandoned that internship, basically, even though they gave me a return offer. And the problem is, because I found out about all of this, let's say around September, a lot of tech internships are recruiting and like interviewing people in September. Most people have their job offers in their hand by October, November. And so by the time I realized I'm not going back to this company, not only was it a huge discouragement of like, okay, these people don't think I'm valuable even after all these years. Now I don't even have any other backups. I have no options. Like maybe that was a stupid idea. And it felt like there was no clarity coming through with prayer and with the people that I knew. I was like, is this a sign from God basically saying your future is not in tech, like you need to study something else? And so it was like a time period of a lot of transitions. And I was just in the dark for maybe 4 months. I just had no options. And then around March, I was just trying anywhere. I was trying to put my resume anywhere. And I randomly, I think when I was, there was like this board where it's like a questions board where you're supposed to ask questions for class. But I was like, let me see what's on like my account profile. And then I realized you can upload your resume there. So I did. And then like recruiters started reaching out to me. And then suddenly like a recruiter from this like tech company, this startup paid really well. They like emailed me and they were like, oh, let's set up an interview. Like there was no preliminary thing. Like they were like, we want to interview with you. And then I just had one day of like rounds of interviews with them. And then I got the offer like a week later. And so it was a lot of buildup and a lot of anticipation and a lot of like calling my mom crying, like, oh my gosh, I made such a good decision. Like, why did I not take that internship? I don't even, and it was a lot of like, oh my gosh, what does God want? And so, yeah, that was a really difficult time to try and stay faithful and try and trust in God during that time period. But it kind of felt like, I think we're going to talk about this in some later questions, but that idea of like, okay, I've been like casting my net for months now during the time where it's like the season for people to be hiring and nothing. And then when it's like the latest possible month, like March for a June internship, it's like, okay, something, God, someone is telling me, okay, try something completely random and cast your net one more time. And thankfully it worked out for me and I had a really great internship that summer. But yeah, that's what came to mind.
What summer of college was that? Was that between your junior and senior year? Or?
That was after my sophomore year. So I had worked for that company until after my freshman year. And then I worked this was for Uber in 2019. Yeah. So my sophomore year.
Wow. So if you hadn't made that discovery about the disparity, you might have gone to that company after college and been all in there, right?
Right. I never would have come to Washington. I probably wouldn't have tried other internships or anything like that. It was like that was the final blow. I was like, this is ridiculous.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's something institutionally rotten about a company that can offer no real explanation for something like that, sounds like God was protecting you from making the final wrong decision for going somewhere that you didn't realize until then was hugely problematic. Praise God! What a great story! Thank you for sharing that.
Right.
Brandon or Michael, do you either of you have anything you want to comment on this particular question?
Yeah, I was just going to briefly add that it's what struck me in Valexa's experience is that, you know, even despite the disappointment of the initial internship that she had lined up and sort of, you know, finding out what sounds like organizationally what was awaiting her there, that despite that disappointment, like God was still protecting her, as you mentioned, Marvin, which is I would say for me is a good takeaway, right? Like sometimes we go through trials and experiences in life and we're disappointed that, you know, we didn't get that job, we didn't get that internship, we didn't you know, we didn't get that, you know, that thing, whatever that thing is out there that we want in life. But that sometimes that disappointment is coming from a place where God is steering us towards something that's better.
Yeah. So you know, and the spiritual component of this is it looks so bleak, right? And at the end of all that, Alexa, what kind of impact did you feel like this experience had on your faith?
I mean, I think after it took me a minute to realize, I think, what happened and like realize some of those valuable lessons. Like when I was kind of debriefing with my parents, like, can you believe like that was kind of a roller coaster? That stuff doesn't usually happen to me. Like usually I'm very cautious. I always have a backup plan, always have things lined up. And so I think after this, when I was kind of praying about it, it's like sometimes you don't realize like your prayers are being answered in advance. I think it's just like, oh wow, all of these small decisions that I never would have made before really added up in the end. And I think it kind of helped me again, like have that idea reinforced that God has a plan, even when it seems like there's no plan. And that I think, yeah, that was the biggest thing that I was able to grow in. I think before everything in my life, you know, high school, middle school, elementary school, like everything is all very clearly planned out for you. And so I feel like I never really had to trust God in such a strong way. And so when this happened, yeah, I think it really reinforced my faith and my trust. Like, okay, God always has a plan, even when I feel like I'm completely in the dark and nothing is working out. And what are all these signs pointing to? Yeah, that was a beautiful moment.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that because, and as I've gotten to know Valexa, I'm so impressed by this intelligent young woman because she is such a hard worker. She is so proactive. She challenges herself and she has organized her life for success. In some ways, you know, being taken out of that, or through your efforts everything's working out, is sometimes what's necessary, right, to lead us to trust God. All right, let's move on to the second question. I'll put this in the chat. All right, when Jesus bade Peter to let his nets down into the water, he didn't want to do it. He knew that you couldn't catch much fish during the day with nets. But he said, quote, "Nevertheless, at thy word, I will let down the net." Why does Jesus sometimes command us to obey him when we don't want to, and when we don't think it will make a difference?
I think in excuse me. I think in that one question, we notice a couple of things going on with Peter, and the fact that he knows that you can't catch fish during the day with net, because you'd see the nets, right? Um, it kind of goes into trusting yourself more than God, and that's why I think God kind of tells you, believe me anyway, even though it may not make sense to you, because I see things you don't see. And it's about faith, right? It's about putting your complete trust in him and doing what he says. Because, for example, there is a quote that a friend of mine constantly tells me, and he says it's confident. There we go. Confidence is the reliance on things that you've trained for to come through for you in the future. And I think the way you communicate with God and trust and just have faith in him and continue to do what he asks you to do, it helps strengthen your ability to always do what he wants you to do. So in Alexa's story, there may have been moments of places, opportunities where you could have placed your faith in God, right? And that helps train you to listen to that voice in the back of your head that says, okay, this is the right decision for me. I feel like this is God telling me to move this way, and having faith and trust in that discernment, you know?
Right. Yeah, there are a lot of times that we don't want to follow the law, but if you only pick and choose when you want to follow the law, then you're not really following the law, right? When you're just being selective about it. And what I like about what Michael's saying is that, God challenges us to obey him, even when we don't want to, and then that can actually unlock, right, all sorts of blessings, but also, especially when it's in his kind of foreordained way, knowing us, knowing the future that he has in store for us, kind of preparing us, right? We can obey him in situations where we don't really want to. It's a little bit putting us out, it's irritating, or we just don't quite see why. But then in the obedience, in that experience, it prepares us for greater tasks, for greater trials in the future. The third question, I think Michael's going to take the lead for us on this one too. Is this? It's somewhat related. What does the passage, quote, "love for their master moved the disciples to obey," mean to you? Has this ever happened to you? Please share.
I mean, I think, yes, it happens a lot for me. And it happens more often now that I've developed my own personal relationship with God. And at least I can see it better. I think, like many of us growing up, we start our relationship with God from our parents, and we just continue learning what they teach and stuff like that. And as you grow, you start to develop your own relationship with God, diving into what he means to you in your actual personal life. And when you develop that loving relationship with God, you want to do what he wants you to do. You want to obey him. I think it's similar to the saying where you are compelled to do the things for someone, even though you love them. I mean, because you love them, even if you don't want to, even if it's something that goes against your best, your instinct, something that makes you personally adverse to the whole decision. Because you love them, you do it anyway. And I think it's similar to relationships as well. You may not want to do what your partner wants you to do. You may not want to go on a hike. You may not want to go flower picking or go gaming or whatever the experience is. But because you love them, you do it. And I think God fashions those relationships after our relationship with Him. You do these things for God because you love Him, because you want to obey Him.
Yeah, when I think about the law, right, especially for those of us who've grown up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, uh, the law can be we can have a very complicated, fraught relationship with the law. And the biggest accusation or the biggest pitfall for Seventh-day Adventists can often be legalism, right? So I've kind of seen the law as, we kind of go through, well, hopefully a growth process in relationship to the law, right? With the law, especially when we're young, right? Why do we obey the rules, or why do we obey the law? It's because we're afraid of getting in trouble, right? We know that the consequences of breaking the law, you can get in trouble by your parents or by the police authorities or by God, right? At some point, we start to understand that the law, the Ten Commandments, can be a promise. Yeah, if we follow the law, good things will happen. It may not be right away, but if we order our lives in a way that God instructs us to through His law, boy, long term, we're really going to benefit from that, right? But at some point, God asks us to obey Him, and we're not going to get in trouble if we don't, or we won't really benefit ourselves if we do. Maybe He's asking us to obey Him to help someone else, right? So maybe it's not necessarily, don't commit adultery, but it's be a fisher of men, or feed the naked, or not feed the naked, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. My brain's a little fried this week, right? We don't want to, right? But we do because we love Him, right? So have you guys noticed this kind of progression in your lives, and what kind of brought you through this?
I think for me, continually listening to the little moments where it's like, what would Jesus do? What would Jesus want me to do? And it's about having that confidence in Jesus. For me, it's been the little moments where for example, you said feeding the hungry, where I may see someone who is in need and I'll give them some money or give them some food or stuff like that. And those little moments have helped, I believe, helped humble me and helped me learn to listen to the voice of God more that says, okay, help this person in need, be more giving, be less prideful, be a person who cares about others and is able to share God's love with them.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to the next question. It's number 4. While the other disciples struggled to bring in the miraculously bountiful catch of fish, Peter fell at the feet of Jesus and exclaimed, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." Why did Peter have this odd reaction to the miracle? And I did find it odd just on the surface, right? You can imagine the exultant celebration, the amazing surprise. Wow. And from later on in the chapter, you realize what a bountiful catch this was, because Ellen White says that for the use of his boat, Peter was recompensed. In other words, I read that to mean that that catch that day more than several times paid for the actual cost of the boat, right? So here's this amazing thing happening, right? And in the midst of this, Peter throws himself at the feet of Jesus and says, "Depart from me. Just I can't bear for you to be in my presence because I'm such a sinner." Right? Why do you think he did that?
Yeah. Yeah, Marvin, I had a few thoughts on this question as I kind of reflected on it throughout the week. So throughout the night on the boat, so there's Peter, there's the other disciples, they're facing these ranges of emotions, like you mentioned. John the Baptist had previously been in prison, so they were experiencing discouragement and loneliness. Um, and so in hindsight, I think for us today and in modern times, it's easy for us to look at Peter and the disciples throughout their experience and state that their Lord and Savior was in their presence, waiting and willing to be their source of comfort and assurance. But the reality, however, is that we here today are no different than Peter and the other disciples were, in that, if we believe the power and omnipotence of God, then we should be able to have the faith and confidence that Peter needed in the boat when we face challenges in our lives. So, here they are in the midst of the miracle that Jesus provided for the disciples, in the form of once barren fishing nets now overfilled with schools of fish. I was struck by Peter's humility, self-reflection, and sense of unworthiness in falling to the feet of Jesus, while the other disciples were busy gathering up the fish, right? Their record catch. So I reflected on the reality that while we naturally default to rejoicing as we receive whatever that desired blessing is that God is now providing us, contextualizing the notion that the creator of the universe, our Lord and Savior, would choose to be present with us should always, continually move us into a sense of, unworthiness and humility. But a big but, fortunately, we can also rest in the fact that, God's love and grace can bridge that divide between our sense of unworthiness and God's holiness. And I think those emotions, that immediate realization by Peter is what sort of compelled him to take that action. So, my takeaway was that in order for the disciples, who were, fishermen by trade, at least a couple of them, to develop a firm foundation of faith that allowed them to believe in God, to believe that God would supply all their needs, and later minister to others about this faith that they developed, Jesus needed to sort of allow them to experience the lows of self-attainment. So, and then also combat that with the highs of divine abundance, right? So sort of tearing down, you know, allowing them to experience like self-distrust. I think it was mentioned earlier by one of the panelists, like not allowing them to rely exclusively on their trained experience and wisdom, but sort of God allowing them to experience the valley, so to speak, so that he can take them to the peaks and show them the divine power of God.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Brandon. Peter's one of my favorite characters in the New Testament, probably because I can identify with him so much. Well, what a prideful man I am. But these kind of intense extremes, he's so prideful, but he's so honest as well with himself, right? So he kind of holds himself to task more intensely, right? Throughout the Bible, and not just in this story. And what I took away from this was that, all night long they're laboring and he's fishing and nothing's happening. He's feeling sorry for himself. And I think he's doubting Jesus, right? Because, these men were Zionists. They were patriots. They hated the yoke of Rome, and they thought that Jesus was going to be the promised Messiah, and they were going to be the lieutenants, maybe the generals. And I think they were excited by the early miracles that Jesus showed, right? Uh, but then, John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, is thrown in prison, and all the Jewish leaders didn't embrace Jesus. Instead, they were looking to tear him down. And I think Peter spent all night doubting Jesus. right? And then the Bible, and then Ellen White says, this particular miracle, I think, really hit home to Peter, because he knew, right? He knew as a fisherman his whole life, this just doesn't happen, right? So it didn't just get lucky.
Yeah.
He realized that Jesus was the Lord and master of all nature. So he wasn't just a wise rabbi or maybe even just kind of a charismatic leader. He was God.
Yeah. Yeah, I also kind of tried to tap into their mindset a little bit, in the sense that at this point in their walk with Christ, they already knew, and to some degree had already come to terms with what it was they were giving up, right? They were giving up their community, their church, perhaps their jobs, their careers, their family, perhaps whatever degree of wealth they may have had, their social connections, in order to go on this walk with Jesus. And so that, for a lot of them, was likely a lot in and of itself to deal with, to grasp, to come to terms with. But now, as you mentioned earlier, there's also this revelation that this walk that they're going to have with Christ could very well, looking at the experience that John the Baptist faced, could very well lead to their imprisonment, or perhaps even death, right? So they're looking at what they gave up. They're looking at what their life could eventually turn out to be, and how it could eventually end, or end in death or imprisonment. And they likely were facing a lot of significant questions and doubts and fears, perhaps. And I think that kind of aligns with the sense of loneliness that they were feeling. And so that the experience that they went through was likely very much needed.
Yeah. So I think it really helps for us to give human recognition of the humanity of those who were so blessed to be around Jesus, and not be judgmental. I'm glad, Brandon, that you led off with that, because even though they had witnessed these miracles, it would be so easy to be discouraged like they were. Let's move on to the next question. And this is kind of a corollary too, because this is going on at this moment. At the same time that Peter asked Jesus to depart from him, he clung to his feet. This is when Jesus issued the charge, "Fear not, from henceforth thou shalt catch men." So Jesus was formally calling Peter to be his disciple. Why was this the right time for Jesus to issue the call? So again, Paul's just such a great, I'm not Paul, Peter's such a great character, right? He's saying, "I'm so unworthy, to depart from me," but he's grabbing onto his feet, right? So he's saying one thing, he's giving voice to his shame and his repentance in his heart, but he's doing something different. He's clinging onto the feet of Jesus. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, also that question at the beginning, the framing of it is so funny. It just made me think of like K-dramas where they're like, "Oh, please kill me. I didn't know." And then they're like, "No, please actually don't kill me." Like, I don't know. I thought that was so funny. But I think the reason why Jesus issued the call to the disciples at this time was, it was when their minds and hearts were going to be most receptive to it. I think Brenda did a great job of kind of setting the context of the scene, where it's like John the Baptist is in prison, like one of the major like advocates of this time, and then religious leaders who are established and everything are doubting Jesus and saying, "Oh, this guy's a fraud, he's not real, like this is not the real Messiah." And then, but on the other hand, there were huge swarms of people still coming to see Jesus and pushing to the front and still trying to just hear his message. So it's like, okay, on one hand, we have all of these really bad things going on and a lot of doubt and a lot of things, but then there's also a lot of people who are really believing in this guy. Like, what is the deal? So I can imagine Peter having this like kind of conflict in his mind. And then I think what maybe pushed all of the disciples over the edge into being in their most like receptive mindset was this miracle, where it's like, I think it just does a great job of showing Jesus's servant leadership firsthand. Like, I think someone who can perform miracles like Jesus, who's the Son of God like Jesus, they could have been like, "Oh, well, I'm the Son of God," leadership of position, that type of thing, where you're kind of abusing your position to enforce your leadership. which can ultimately just like sow resentment and kind of hatred, where people will be like, fine, I'll listen to you, but I don't want to. Versus this idea of servant leadership, like going out with fishermen and helping them have their biggest catch ever, right? And like even pushing your boat out so more people can see you and not just the people who were able to get there the first. So I think just after Peter saw so many examples of Jesus's like servant leadership and willing to be amongst like the most like humble people in humble positions, I think he was touched by that. And I think it kind of goes to that earlier question of like, oh, why would they obey if it kind of feels like there's no point or something like that? And I think it's just because of love and like wanting to follow Jesus in that sense. And so, yeah, I think that's like one component of it. And then also, there was a theme I saw in this chapter where it was talking a lot about like fruitlessness. And it was like they had a night of like fruitless toil. They're weary with fruitless toil. I think in the second or third paragraph, it's like no lesson of Christ felt fruitless, like weary with the night of fruitless. It was like fruitless like 4 times or something. And it was like his presence kindled their faith, brought them joy and success. So it is with us, apart from Christ, our work is fruitless. But then at the very end of the chapter, in the second to last paragraph, it says, he who longs to be of service to Christ is so quickened by the life-giving power of the Son of Righteousness that he is enabled to bear much fruit to the glory of God. And so I think in order to enter into Christ's joy, we have to participate in his labor. And so I think these disciples became Jesus's like first fruits or first examples of how he can allow us to be fruits that flourish. And that's because they were, I guess, in the right mindset for that after all of the things that he had just shown them.
Fantastic. Well, Sam has appeared on screen, and I take that as he's got some insight for us. So please.
Thank you. And thank you, Marvin, for asking that question. I thought it was a really, really good question. I think that what we learn from this particular narrative is the most appropriate time for you to be called to the service of Jesus is at your lowest. Mm-hmm. And I think that many times, I'll speak for myself, that's the least likely time that I find myself approaching Jesus at my lowest, because I fill my mind with all kinds of insecurities, and I'm not worthy, that I cannot do this, and I've failed, and I've this, and I've that. And I think one of the reasons why Jesus wants us to realize our appropriateness in our lowest is because that's the point that you will have enough humility to accept that you are weak enough to depend upon him fully. And I think Simon Peter teaches us a really valuable lesson to reframe what struggle and pain and letting down God actually looks like on a practical level. When we look at ourselves, we might look at ourselves with shame and disgust and what have you. But it's quite clear from this narrative, Jesus did not see that when he looked at Simon Peter. Mm. When Jesus looked at Simon Peter, and I think it's quite evident from Jesus's call to Simon Peter, was, I need you to get up and see yourself how I see you. I see you as someone who is fit to serve. Mm. And that's my answer to that question I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think one of the most beautiful, this moment where Peter is saying, I'm not worthy, depart from me, because he recognized how shameful his thoughts and his doubting of Jesus was through the night. But at the same time, he's clinging onto Jesus's feet. That to me is this beautiful moment. And I like how Alexa referenced K-dramas, because there's always a moment, right, where whether it's the guy or the girl who comes from a terrible background, or maybe they had made some huge mistake, or right, if we're they don't think they're worthy of the other love interests, right? And so they'll leave, right? Or they'll pretend to break up, right? Because they aren't worthy of the person that they love, right? But in their heart, they hope that even though they know they're not worthy, the person they love will still find that they're worthy. Will seek after them, right? Will gather them up in their shame and unworthiness and bring them into their heart, right? So that's what I saw in this moment with Peter, that even though forensically, legally, by his own actions, he was not worthy of Jesus's love. So he said, "Depart from me, because I'm not worthy." Yet he clung to the feet of Jesus because he trusted that Jesus still would love him, and that he loved him with a redemptive love. And I feel like I know in my own experience that was the moment for me. And then that was the moment that Jesus called them to be his disciples. So let's move to the next question. Until this time, Peter, James, and John had one foot in their worldly pursuit as fishermen and the other foot in discipleship to Christ. This was the moment that they went all in. When did you go all in being a Christ follower? What had to happen in your life for this to happen?
Yeah, Marvin, I can comment on it first. So just for clarity, when I first read the question, I actually decided to tweak it just a little bit, and I'll explain why a little bit later.
Sure.
But for me personally, I changed it to when did I decide to first go all in on being a Christ follower? So I was 20 years old, and I guess just to summarize it, I was like within a 9-month time frame. I went from um, believing in God but not being a member of any church, not regularly attending church, not having a community of believers I associated with, not reading any type of religious Bibles or anything, like religious readings, etc. And so within a 9-month time frame, when I was 20 years old, I went from attending a college in Chicago where I lived at the time to walking into the doors of an Adventist church and doing Bible studies and getting baptized and deciding to transfer universities and go to an Adventist university. So I would say in relation, I was a rather quick study and comer to Christ, so to speak,
Mm.
within a relatively short time frame. And so I was, first year student, a sophomore at Oakwood University in Huntsville, Alabama. I have to give a shout out to my alma mater. But within my first year, I think it was second semester, I was still a relatively ascending new believer. Did a lot of reading, a lot of praying, a lot of learning formally, including at school. But I had not yet had my own like strong one-on-one experience with God. And it was my second semester in my sophomore year. Still first year there at the university, and I'd come down with stomach flu, which really hampered me. It hit me hard for about 2 to 3 days, and just all the things, I won't go into detail, all the things that come associated with having a very upset stomach, and including body aches and pain and nausea and fatigue and upset stomachs and everything else, without going into detail. But it was, all the while I'm as a new believer, I'm going through this experience, and I'm like praying a lot to God, and I'm expecting almost immediate response. I'm like, God, I'm here with you. I'm experiencing this for the first time as a believer. This illness, I'm expecting something to happen, and nothing was happening, and it was pushing on into day two, and in the evening of day two, and I was like no end in sight. And I'm having this sense of like frustration and questions and doubts, and like, well, should I just go to the hospital? But it didn't seem that severe, but it was still quite discomforting. And so I just decided, well, okay, I'm going to continue to pray and only drink water, which I could barely keep down, and I'm just going to go, even though I was feeling like, you know, God was just telling me to hold fast and hold firm and not do anything and to trust in him. I said, well, I'm just going to go off campus, went to the pharmacy and, you know, got some medication and um, even in the parking lot of the pharmacy, decided to start taking the I think it was Pepto-Bismol or something. And you know, I couldn't keep it down. it was it was just bad. And so I'm like even more deflated now. It's like medicine isn't even working. So I get back to my dorm on campus and I'm just like sitting in the car and I just had this sense of like um uh I probably should remember this, but there was something I was reading at the time where it just talked about like in the moments of your struggle and feeling defeated, like worship God, right? And so then I just in the car I turned on some music and you know for roughly like 30 minutes just you know began to like feeling really sick, worship God and singing, did a bit of crying, and honestly towards the end like I just felt this sense of like strong like warmth that came over me, and you know feeling like God was telling me everything's going to be all right, and immediately you know all the discomfort and everything just went away. um, and it was really profound for me. It was my very first like direct experience where it was unexplainable, right? Where you know, similar to the experience that the disciples went through in this lesson, where it was unexplainable, it was unexpected. I could not have planned for it, and I could not explain it even after the fact, right? Even though you know I told you know several friends and whatnot at the time, and you know many of them just said at the time like this is your testimony, this is part of your faith walk. So that was my my first individual sort of personalized experience, even after I'd you know formally become a member of the church, you know, being baptized and whatnot. That was the first time I went all in. And so I'll just explain a little bit while I said why I used why I added the subtext first, went all in, because as you know as I was kind of remembering back and reflecting on this experience, I thought to myself, well, to use a t-shirt size analogy, small, medium, large, extra large, if at that time when I was a new believer, and let's say my faith was a t-shirt size small, and now 20 years later as a 40-year-old husband and father, let's say my faith is a medium, right? Um, and we believe that and we see through this experience that God wants us to be all in. So all in 20 years ago for me is does not equal all in today.
Mhm.
And so what that meant to me and what I kind of pondered on and reflected even as recently as last night is that God is likely continually calling us and taking us through experiences that allow us to continue to be all in. And what all in meant, you know, 5, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, however long ago, does not equate to what being all in is continually. And so that was the takeaway for me.
I'm really glad you added that, because even with the story of the disciples, even with Peter, this was definitely a huge all-in moment. But clearly, you know, subsequent to this, you know, he's denying Jesus 3 times, and
Yeah.
he's fleeing, right? And so, in fact, there's another story, right, uh, when Jesus appears and tells him to cast his net on a particular side. So I'm really glad that you added that, because that is the reality of the Christian walk, right? And certainly, I think we all have a moment where we give our lives to the Lord, uh, and He takes us through that experience at the moment, fully and robustly, that we're capable of.
Yeah.
But we hope that we all have extra large shirt sizes in terms
Yeah.
of our faith ahead of us, right?
Yeah.
Really
Yeah.
do.
If faith is a muscle, I think God wants us to continue to stay in the gym.
That's
So
right. He wants he wants us to get buff and cut like Arnold.
yeah. And no pain, no gain.
Michael, did you
To
have a
add,
comment? Yeah.
yeah, to add, basically, I think this goes hand in hand with what Pastor Sam was saying with the rock bottom and being at your lotus. I think your all in is where your rock bottom changes. Everyone has a different rock bottom.
Hmm.
For example, like you were saying earlier, what's going on in the minds of the disciples, and what Marvin was saying about Peter being recompensed. For all we know, Jesus had to make Peter recompense, because had he walked with him, who knows, his mind may have been on that boat that he hasn't paid off yet. His mind may have been, okay, Lord, I am trying to follow you, and I want to give up everything, but there's this boat that I have this debt for. I can't pay it off. I don't know what to do, and all this stuff. And in that moment, Jesus solves all those problems, right? And that was Peter's rock bottom. As you were saying, with the shirt sizes and growing, your rock bottom changes. Your rock bottom now could be a car loan. Your rock bottom now could be a well, for me, student loans. it changes with where you are in your life. And I think that was a really good like correlation between what all of you guys said.
Yeah, there definitely is, certainly in my life, it's when I've hit rock bottom, which is, it's kind of like making room for God, right? To truly work a miracle in my life and transform my heart. Well, our last kind of specific question is number 7. Jesus recruited humble and unlearned men to be his disciples. Why did he do this? How can high educational and professional achievement be a barrier to following Christ? How can they be a blessing and resource in growing God's kingdom?
Yeah, so I think I've heard a saying before, it's like, oh, Jesus does not call the qualified, rather he qualifies the called, or instead he qualifies the called, something like that. But I feel like it's both. Like, I think he does call the qualified and qualifies the called, but I think maybe the humble and unlearned men that he surrounded himself with were people who did not have too much pride to follow someone who didn't necessarily have like all of the credentials maybe that someone else would be seeking out. I think God does not despise education. I think he encourages people to be educated and like have a solid foundation of wisdom and everything. But some of the people who were the educated religious leaders of the time, like the Pharisees, were the ones casting the most doubt on Jesus's journey, because they had I think a lot of pride and maybe a strong sense of self. And so I think people maybe who don't have the exact background and don't have like all of this religious training and everything like that, or maybe who were trained in something else or something like that, and maybe don't have all of the necessary qualifications, don't feel like they're the best speaker, don't feel like they know how to spread God's message, they're the ones who are more receptive and more open to trying something new and being open to God's influence. I think in the chapter, in the third to last paragraph, it says like, he who loves Christ the most will do the greatest amount of good. There is no limit to the usefulness of one who by putting self aside makes room for the working of the Holy Spirit upon his heart and lives a life wholly consecrated to God. If his people will remove the obstructions, he will pour forth the waters of salvation in abundant streams through the human channels. So I think the thing that stood out for me is like this idea of putting self aside, removing obstructions from your life. Someone who maybe is unqualified won't have as many of those obstructions and walls up to not listen to God's influence. I think sometimes people who are educated, maybe they have a lot of self-confidence. We don't have a lot of room for God to work in our lives. So I think what this took away from me is like making sure I have room in my life and in my mind, in my heart, and in my spirit for God to work in my life, no matter how educated I am or no matter how many qualifications I have, but like removing those obstructions to become like that humble person that God can call and use.
You know, I think of Nicodemus, right? He, because of his position, because of his training, because of his education, his heart was hardened, but he had a little nugget, right, where the Holy Spirit's bugging him, and he sought out the truth, but at night, right? And I think he did become a Christ follower, but he didn't have the freedom to do that until Christ was already gone. Right? And I think about the Pacific Northwest, about how educated and affluent it is here, and therefore how difficult it is to call people for them to recognize their need of a redeemer and a savior, right? Yet I do believe, right, that if we can humble ourselves, those of us who, who have sought higher education and so forth, God's blessed that, all the more, God can use us to bless others. So real quickly, we've just got 2 minutes left. I'm going to go around the room. And what lesson or insight from today's reading and discussion was most compelling to you? We'll start with Alexa and then go to Michael and then Brandon.
I feel like sometimes, like Peter, I want to kind of hide away and be like, no, get away from me, God. Like, I'm too impure, I'm too unholy, like, please get away. Maybe because of the consequence of my own actions or thinking doubtful things. But the only way to have joy and believe and hope is to stay close with Jesus and to walk with him as closely as possible. So that's something that I've taken away today.
I think I took away two things. One being that whole hideaway thing. That sometimes I am like in a worship session just by myself singing and praising God, and I'll think, God, why do you love me? Like, why do you do the things you do for me? And after like I kind of like sit in that moment and just sit with the thought, I'll like laugh hysterically after. I was like, God, it doesn't make sense. It literally does not make sense. But thank you for loving me the way I am, and thank you for like we were saying, qualifying me. And then I think the other part is that pridefulness, because I think it's something I would like to work on in myself, and like saying less of me and more of God, especially since I heard a sermon recently where they were talking about basically this, where you are kind of hindered when you put yourself before God, you put your education, you put your wealth and your stuff like that. It's like the rich young ruler who didn't want to give up his wealth and stuff like that. And in some of our cases, it's like education, whereas we see our own self-importance and more stuff like that. And I think that's something I would like to work on to like try and bring God closer to me.
Yep, I would agree. And for me, I would say the one of the key takeaways was just the concept of self-distrust and not exclusively relying on my own professional or personal experiences in life to get me through whatever challenge it is that I'm facing, right? Whether it's in my personal life or my work life, etc. And in deferring to and defaulting to God's plan, God's direction and guidance, no matter how radical or unfathomable the guidance may be, based on those experiences, right? And I think that's a strong tie into just developing more and more faith incrementally through our walk with Christ.
Awesome. Well, that brings us to the end of our panel discussion. Thank you so much, the three of you, for giving of your time, and what a wonderful discussion this was. For everyone who's logged in, we want to announce that church service starting 1 hour, 11:15 at Eastside SDA Fellowship. We hope that you can join us in person or online if you're not nearby. And